you ask me what I'm trying to achieve, I actually don't have like a great answer for you. What do I know I want to do for sure? I want to do interesting things that are meaningful and I want to have fun. And those are my guiding lights.
Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship by Venture for Canada. Venture for Canada is a national charity on a mission to foster the entrepreneurial skills and mindsets of young Canadians. Our vision is a Canada where young people can equitably realize their entrepreneurial potential to help build one of the most prosperous entrepreneurial ecosystems in the world.
There are many different ways to be an entrepreneur. It's not just all about launching tech startups. You can also be an entrepreneur in the policy realm.
Sure.
And the guest on this week's episode is somebody who I think is extremely well suited to speak on the topic of how to be a policy entrepreneur. This week's guest is Vass Bednar, who is the executive director of the Master of Public Policy program at McMaster University. And I first met Vass through the Action Canada Fellowship, which we both did.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Vass did a fantastic session for my cohort on knowledge mobilization, which is essentially how do you, promote ideas? How do you mobilize knowledge so it doesn't just sit in a book, but it actually influences things? Vass, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
To get things kicked off, Vass, what is policy entrepreneurship?
In the capital A academic literature, policy entrepreneurship gets a bad rap. It's actually kind of in a negative light. It's about kind of exploiting gaps or kind of uh, anyway. It's a term, let's just say, that that deserves some reclaiming, because I sort of see the activity of policy entrepreneurship as sort of spotting harms on the horizon, being more creative, thinking of yourself as kind of a policy designer or a policy architect, because we see that issues more and more are kind of transversal or connected. So I like that term. I think it signifies a kind of messiness and speed that we don't always associate with the with the practice of public policy.
Let's bring back policy entrepreneurship as a
Right?
term,
You can
reclaim
help
it.
me. You can help me.
um, to get things kicked off a little bit and framing the conversation, Vass, can you
Yeah.
describe your path into becoming a policy entrepreneur?
Oh my God. I mean, I've always been very jealous of people that had linear, predictable career paths, like really, really jealous. And I felt I've been more of a submarine, right? Like I sort of has submerged myself in the people and the issues and the things that matter to me. And every so often when I have to resurface or put up my periscope, the next thing kind of makes sense. I knew kind of following graduate school that I was resisting being in any one policy domain, though I was drawn to kind of general industrial policy, business, and innovation spaces. And at that time, people talked a lot about different seats at the table, right? Like, don't forget, it wasn't just the lean in discourse of like, make sure you sit at the table, but it was about, there was this emphasis on perspectives. And I sort of just thought, okay, so for 10 years, I'll just make sure I sit at every seat at this imagined table. When I worked in the private sector, I worked at a think tank. I worked as a political staffer for a little bit for 18 months, which in staffer time, I think is like closer to 3 years. Um, I don't want to ramble and tell you my whole CV, but Action Canada, which you mentioned, is definitely a hinge point in my life. A few years after doing Action Canada, I chaired the expert panel on youth employment for the Prime Minister and the Minister of Labor, essentially federally. So it was just like, wrangling brainy people with diverse perspectives and different kind of academic backgrounds to produce a paper that hopefully goes somewhere. And it kind of did. So, how did I get into it? Maybe the better question is like, why can't I get out of it? Like, why am I so obsessed? And I just think public policy is like really interesting and intellectually demanding, and I'm able to bring a kind of magpie approach or spot different trends or connect different dots or sort of point to opportunities that could make something better. And that's where I think, capital E entrepreneurs and policy entrepreneurs actually have more in common than they don't, right? This drive to build things that make things better, I think is very compelling. And I'll just sort of end by saying, public policy. Maybe it sounds boring, even though it has a teeny tiny bit of alliteration, but it's about the software of society, right? And I think that's why it's worth paying attention to, even if it's not part of your day to day.
I think your career has been so interesting, and I think the more interesting careers are the ones that are very non-linear. So, and that's
Yeah.
also I think what's going to
Bumbling,
become.
bumbling through.
It's the more increasingly, as they say in often career development literature, there are not career ladders, there are lattices, which is
Right.
somewhat like trite.
Right. Or back to Sheryl Sandberg. I mean, I know she's basically canceled now, but in that book, her book was like hot at that time, like that coming of age for me. And as she said, to treat it like a playground. And I felt that I've just been treating my career like a scavenger hunt where I find everything that's great, learn from it, and then I'm ready to move on. And, finally, don't forget, I don't know if you're a millennial, but I'm definitely a geriatric millennial. And carving out my career as being characterized by 1 year extension jobs, often without benefits. So I've also experienced the flip side of that, where people might look at a CV and sort of say, oh, she's kind of a dilettante, or she's, trying all these different things on. Well, yeah, I wasn't sure if that contract was going to get renewed. So guess what, everyone? I looked for a different job and then I got it. So I left. I don't know how else to tell you that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot more people are of our generation. I'm a millennial as well. I think
Okay.
ended up pursuing entrepreneurship partly out of necessity.
Hmm.
In the sense, I didn't graduate right in the midst of the global financial crisis. I graduated university in 2013, but
Okay.
I think so many people who were even a couple of years older than me, like
Hmm.
if you graduate in 2009, 2010, even 2011, it was a very challenging circumstance, and I think a lot of people of our generation and of Gen Z kind of have to be at least entrepreneurial in order to thrive in changing kind of times. One thing to zoom in
Mm,
on a little bit, Vass, that you talked about was the
sure.
expert panel on youth employment. Can
Yeah.
you zoom in a little bit about like what was like serving on that? Like, how did you end up serving on that panel?
Mm,
What was that process kind of like of being the chair? What were the
yeah.
outcomes? I'd love to zoom in on that specific kind of experience.
Okay, so I mean, it was a public appointment. I don't know for sure how I was appointed. Basically, someone probably put my name on a list and then someone else didn't take my name off it. I think at that time the government wanted the provocation of having young people, the optics of having young people also lead this. So you could have designed it one of two ways. You could have a young, inexperienced chair, me, and then an esteemed panel, or you could have a young, inexperienced chair and also young, inexperienced panel members. And that's actually how they designed it. So it was me and a bunch of honestly amazing, like, young people, practitioners, people active in the space from across Canada, working across time zones with like jobs and, in I think a couple of instances, kids, right? And then we were working on this project together that also involved public consultation. We were supported by a secretariat, so we could kind of request. We didn't have to like write all our own backgrounder briefs, but I had to become the face of that and the voice of that, and kind of work on it every day, and find space and time for that and make that time and space. When it was all said and done, I would say I had sciatica and I had to do like 2 juice cleanses, to be honest, because I just kind of ran myself into the ground. The sciatica's gone, which is good. But I would like wake up and work on the panel from like 5 to 7:30, and then shower and go to work, and then like finish work and then sit there and do more panel work. So yeah, I mean, you asked, like, how, like, what it was like. That's what it was like. It was like emailing and calling people and getting to travel around Canada and immerse yourself in a topic that you're interested in, but maybe you definitely don't know everything about, and then speak truth to power in an attention economy, right? Like, the older playbook that I think is sometimes presented in terms of how policy change happens, or what people might have told you in Action Canada, write the 80-page paper and then you do the 800-word op-ed and tweet it out, and you're done. I don't think that really exists anymore, but it was definitely something that sent a signal to me that I could do this. And I had an old boyfriend, actually. He used to say, if it's worth doing, it's worth overdoing. And I don't think he was joking. but I repeat that to myself sometimes, like in my mind. It's just like, if you're going to do something, like do it as well as you can and like go all in. Yeah. That's what it was
Uh,
like.
it sounds like an intense times. I have family members who've dealt with sciatica, and dealing with that kind of pain while chairing, while working full time, while chairing a youth
Yeah.
employment, and those quite a lot.
Yeah. My doctor was like, actually, they make some canes that are really cool now. And I wasn't married, but I just started living with my boyfriend. I was like, I don't want a cool cane. I was like, I'm like 28 and a half. I don't want a cane right now. No, but what was it like? I mean, it was an honor,
Yeah.
and, it did lead to, some policy changes, and it led to friendships, and, um, yeah, that's it.
What were some of the recommendations in the report, and what changes did they create?
One of the elements we pointed to was that, the summer jobs program was too time limited and needed to be expanded across the school year. We also pointed to the growth in part-time students, but that part-time students were often ineligible for scholarships or other forms of student support that were kind of built around the full-time student experience. We also talked about, I mean, this is perennial. I don't think it's going away anytime soon, but young people have a real challenge finding relevant work experience. They can get jobs, and actually, right now, it's not, you look at the data, and it's getting harder and harder. But those jobs are often irrelevant to helping them either decide a course of study or kind of affirm higher education or other training that they want to pursue. So those were a couple of some of the main elements that came forward. Of course, mental health at that time. I mean, I'm saying at that time, it wasn't like 100 years ago. It was probably 10 years ago, right? Um, was more and more coming up at institutions, and what supports and elements are available for young people. I mean, right now I'm on an ad hoc advisory board for the Ontario Privacy Commissioner. A few years back, I served for the Ford government, actually, so a different political stripe, on the Ontario Workforce Recovery Advisory Committee. And I think that speaks to, good policy is good politics. And I'm always happy to offer my ideas, whether that's through an op-ed or through, regs to riches, which has been a conversation starter despite outwardly looking like a silly, kind of weird place. And it is silly and weird, but it's mine and I love it. So, yeah.
Let's dive into regs to riches. How did
Okay.
well, first off, what is regs to riches, and how did the idea first emerge to you?
Regs to Riches is a Substack newsletter that I sometimes write. I haven't been writing it that much lately, but I'll get back to it. It started in 2020 in the pandemic. So I didn't have a lot to do other than work and sort of be at my computer. And I felt like observed a gap, a niche that I felt I could dominate. I didn't actually feel that at the time. I sort of was like, these are the issues I'm interested in and kind of want to write about. And at the start, it was broadly about regulation, right? Regs and technology in Canada. But it's generally just kind of like little nuggets or discussions of policy ideas, or a lot of stuff related to making markets more free and fair, right? Like I'm kind of accidentally in this competition policy space, which I think speaks maybe a little bit to us joking around about being entrepreneurial. Maybe being entrepreneurial also means kind of being open. In fall 2020, when McGill called me and said they wanted me to do a paper on the state of competition policy in Canada, which is also the title of the paper we ended up doing, um, I had pitched them on other like papers, but I guess they didn't like my pitches. And they were like, we want something on competition policy. I was like, okay, okay. And they're like, yeah, Vass, like, do you think you could do that? And I remember Googling what is competition policy, like as they were saying that. They're like, Vass? I'm like, yes. I'm like, I do know a bit about it and I'd love to learn more. This is a great forcing function. So count me in. They're like, you can do this? I'm like, yeah, 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 for sure. And then as I was learning about it, I kept being like, okay, this doesn't make sense. Like the law can't actually work this way. And then I would talk to other people who were really smart. They're like, no, 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 that's totally how the law is supposed to work. I'm like, what? So I became a broker of sorts, or like one of the public voices starting to sort of push on the deficiencies with this law. And that's going to sound and feel very old because we've made huge strides in Canada since then, like from 2022 to now. There's been a flurry of policy change. I'm not taking credit for that, but I am one of the sparks that kind of helped draw attention there. And I did it by doing it, right? And that's maybe part of policy entrepreneurship too. I also now have a monthly column with the Report on Business. I write about public policy and technology. And how did that happen? Probably from, for a few years, doing it and kind of being there in the space. And, I don't know if we read all the same books, but the literature does say that women are judged or praised on what they've already done, not their potential, right? So whether or not that's true, we don't have to debate that now. But in terms of, I do get questions where people are like, okay, you do like fun things. Like, how do I do fun things? And I'm like, I don't know. You should just do them and then see where it leads. Like, find ways to be doing what you want to do or to demonstrate it. Yeah. Thanks for letting me ramble. You should interrupt me. Feel free.
No, I think that's your, like, all of the different projects you work on is, I think, a great example of like what exactly is policy entrepreneurship. I think
Sure.
both the
Yeah. Yeah.
expert
Yeah.
panel was like a good description of
Mhm.
it, as well as I think Rags to Riches is like a good example of policy entrepreneurship. And on the topic of like competition policy and
Mhm.
regulatory reform in Canada, I
Yeah.
remember when we first met 2 years ago and you spoke to Action Canada,
Yeah.
or to my cohort. One thing that really resonated with me, and this was almost 2 years ago,
Yeah. Was
was
that was in person, right? That was in person
yes,
at McMaster University. Okay, great. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. I can remember early November
I
in
remember.
Hamilton,
I remember. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I remember.
and
I was pregnant. That's why I remember,
yeah,
right? Yeah.
and you talked about your Free Boswell
Oh,
campaign on,
yeah.
on Twitter. So let's zoom into that because I think it's an interesting example of policy entrepreneurship.
Oh,
What
yeah.
is Free Boswell, and what was its influence?
You know, it was a hashtag that actually led to BetaKit making some swag because BetaKit is great and Douglas is kind of bonkers sometimes. Shout out to Doug. Um, at the time, the Free Britney campaign was kind of at a peak because they were kind of freeing her, I suppose, from her conservatorship. And one of the ideas many people had been putting forward, and that I was also a champion of, was giving the Competition Bureau more intellectual independence. It's currently nested under ISED, the very ministry that has to kind of promote innovation and business growth. So sometimes there's just a natural tension there. Um, and I played around with that hashtag, just sort of saying free Boswell. But honestly, for quite a few people, they're like, "Oh, now that you framed it that way, I get it." Like the parallel, and not to make light of the Britney Spears situation, actually, which is a huge tragedy. Um, but I sort of think what you're asking me is, can you be playful and also be a serious person? Because I do encounter people who feel very strongly that you cannot, right? They're just kind of like, it's suit and tie, it's, formality kind of at all times. I don't ascribe to that. When I was doing my Action Canada fellowship, I also gave a TEDx Toronto talk. The talk was on how to make public policy more fun. I nominated myself for that talk. I was going to get someone to nominate me. Like, I was going to maybe like write the nomination, ask my boss to do it. And then I saw on their website, they had this button that said, click here to nominate yourself. And I thought, what kind of a-hole nominates themselves? And then I was like, oh, I do. Like, I have nothing to lose. I can only gain. And the year after that, I co-hosted the show. So for me to keep myself engaged and having a little bit of fun, I think I like to demonstrate a kind of playfulness or levity, but it's also how I send a signal to people that this stuff is for everyone and that you can be a part of it if you want. I don't feel I need to show off, or when people are like, oh, so and so has to be the smartest person in the room. Well, maybe you are the smartest person in the room, but you can also be kind, and you can also be interesting, and you can also be fun. And that goes back to the attention economy and what we're all competing in the idea space, right?
Yeah, the ideas economy, and I love that, and I think the way you answered the question kind of got to the crux of it, which was how do you make public policy and the questions inherent in it accessible to a much wider
Mhm.
range of the population? I think a lot of the times public policy in Canada and also around the world can be framed too much in like, okay, CDA Howe Institute, like
Oh, right.
luncheon with like lots of, older
Mhm.
people in really, we are having very serious conversations. And to your point, just because you have levity doesn't mean that these issues aren't serious.
Yeah.
But it's a question of how do you make these, how do we broaden the public policy discourse so that it's more inclusive to more people?
Yeah, and you're not, like, in some weird echo chamber. We were joking about reclaiming policy entrepreneurship, but I'd also like to reclaim policy innovation, if you'll let me add to our list, because I think we got to a point where, to use that word, and I know every time you say it, a fairy kind of passes out somewhere, but I think that policy innovation can also be really small. Right, I'm also a fan of, like, modest but meaningful changes, especially when taken in the aggregate, but we got to a point where policy innovation only meant the hugest, most kind of complex, kind of bigger things, and I think that's really wrong because the situation that we're dealing with, and this goes back to, similarities, complementarities between capital E entrepreneurs, policy people, disruptors and wonks, however we wanna frame that kind of false tension, is that, there's been this exponential growth in computational power and different things that startups are doing and et cetera, et cetera. But our legislative capacity hasn't even increased by like a step function. So you're naturally always going to have this gap. It makes it harder to do things, right? So I do have an appreciation for kind of the little things that are just kind of smart policy, but are never going to be a top five, like voter issue or in the headlines every day, but reflect just kind of an amendment to make sure that our legislative infrastructure reflects our reality. And too often, and probably more often than not, it just doesn't, right? And I hate playing catch up. I want to play catch up like really fast and then move on.
Yeah, and to your point, the power of incrementalism is something I think that we often, and is goes underappreciated. I read a book over the holidays last year, and it was all about the power of taking gradual incremental action, and that we often live in an era where we think we need to have these massive breakthroughs like
Right.
all at once. I think the book is called Gradual, if I recall.
Yeah.
This book on incrementalism. But I think incrementum as a broader philosophy is something that's often significantly underappreciated.
Yeah. Definitely. I mean, incrementalism is how we build ourselves too in our own minds, sort of thing. For young people who might be listening, though I like to present myself as young, it doesn't always work, nor should it. Um, what are you doing from 5 to 7, Monday to Thursday after work? I mean, do fun stuff for yourself, see your friends, go to the gym, but go to book launches, go to talks, go to those opportunities. That's where you start to build kind of that fabric and all that learning. And again, doesn't happen overnight. It's not going to be that one networking thing you dragged yourself to that sort of changed your career overnight. Anyway, I don't mean to preach to you about that. I find it comes up a lot when young people talk to me and I'm just like, you know what you should do? Things. Things that you like and can be fun.
And to your point, a life and a career is built like very gradually over time. I am thinking of there's a section of that book on incrementalism where the author talks about the Ernest Hemingway line about how the character in the Sun Always Also Rises says, they describe him as going bankrupt gradually and then all at
Right.
once, and
Yeah.
it's become kind of trite. But they say the reason why this quote is like used is probably one of the most like quoted pieces of
Yeah.
like literature in like I feel like so many different newspaper articles, is because it's true. It's in the sense that like kind of things happen really gradually, and then all of a sudden, it can feel like a surprise, but it
Yeah.
actually isn't. It's been building for a really long time.
I like that. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
One thing that I was interested in to zoom in on a little bit is platform building as a
Mhm.
policy kind of entrepreneur. And to go
Mm.
back to Regs to Riches is, I think a lot of people have, okay, someone will think, oh, I have cool ideas, but then how do you actually build like a platform that can
Mm.
be like kind of significant? And I think sometimes in the Canadian context where we're a smaller population vis-a-vis the US, like building a platform can take, a lot of work. I would also say in the US context, it's not easy, but there's new
No, no, no.
platforms like Substack, right? And you
Yeah,
have people like Paul Wells, piecing out of,
Paul's
traditional
killing it.
journalism.
Yeah. Paul's killing it.
And
He also refers subscribers to me actually, 'cause
oh,
he
that's awesome.
recommends Rex to Riches, just wanna say.
I have seen his recos on Rex to Riches, sometimes. But yeah, I
Woo!
have to say Paul Wells is a kind of policy entrepreneur, too.
Yeah.
But I guess the question I have for you is, what advice do you have to listeners who might be interested in policy and are trying to build kind of a platform for themselves on how to on how to build a platform to actually kind of promote their ideas?
I think hmm, yeah, you're right. It's everything's kind of different in Canada. I mean, for me, the activity of writing was useful. I had also, a few years before, suffered a bad concussion, and I had a kind of longer recovery. Mild traumatic uh, are two words that shouldn't go together. Mild traumatic brain injury. It's like very funny, I think, to sort of say that those two words together. So sometimes writing for me is like it's like doing a puzzle. It's like doing a Sudoku. It's like, okay, I've been thinking about this. Let me take an hour and a half. Can I do 750 words and just kind of think it through? Um, for some people, it's not writing, it's video, right? Or short snippets and other mediums where they kind of want to be. But again, back to sometimes when I'm either interviewing young people that I might be hiring or just kind of advising them, and I don't mean to get preachy, but people often declare an interest in something. They claim that they're interested in something. But when I kind of probe a little bit and want to substantiate it, it's not that there's nothing there, it's that there's just nothing tangible, right? Like it's like, well, what are you reading? What are you doing? Like, where are you volunteering? Have you been to like any conferences related to that? There's just it's like it's not there. It's like, well, I'm interested in it. I'm like, okay, like what does that mean to you? So I always again I just sort of push people to be like, for me, I could have just said for a few years that I was really interested in public policy and technology, but instead I was kind of showing that and being a voice. It was very very scary, right? Thinking out loud and in the open, you make mistakes, people criticize you, I always get mean notes when I write in the Globe and Mail. So does my editor. So does the dean of my program. Sometimes even the president at the university. These are not. I don't think it's like a normal thing. I don't think the people who do this are like necessarily um, totally okay. But people want to tell you not just that they disagreed with you, but that you're dumb and that you shouldn't be writing. And I think for a lot of people that can be a deterrent, right? It kind of sucks. It never feels good. But then I'm also like, I think I'm doing something right if I'm inspiring people to take the time very kindly to track me down and give me a piece of their mind. Yeah.
Yeah, the online commenters are pretty, they can be pretty, off the wall.
And resourceful and resourceful.
Yeah, and we're resourceful. I
Mhm.
mean, I've not done nearly the policy entrepreneurship or writing of you, but and even the little bit of writing I've done, and I'm a white male who gets probably a lot less vitriol. I get, persistent comments
Mm.
in almost every piece that I write, where people are like, "But don't let Jared from the Subway commercials." Oh,
What?
there's a few commenters, and I was like, I don't think I look like Jared from like Subway related. But it's so funny just because to the point about like
Mm.
the vitriol and personal attacks that exist in this era. Sometimes I write something that is pretty like inoffensive, and it's like these trolls keep on
Yeah.
kind of coming after. But it's a point about there's a degree of like I think even if you're not nonpartisan and you're trying to influence policy conversations, people are just so vitriolic that it can you have there's almost a degree of developing thick skin. At least I found in my own experience that I feel like I've had to just like laugh off kind of, and to say that's not that it's insignificant, but it's in some ways, unfortunately, part of the broader kind of environment.
I'm glad you mentioned that because it's probably should be part of training and we should sort of be more aware of it. I'm thinking of like the media training through Action Canada or just kind of anything, even professionally, right? Like when people are like, my account doesn't reflect my employer or whatever. It's like, well, sometimes your employer you're going to share something that you did at work because you're excited about it. And like there's going to be reactions which are going to make you feel a particular way. And how do you brace yourself for that? How do you ignore it? I think is important. Sometimes I do forward stuff to my editor just because I want my editor to know who people who have been DICKs to me in case those DICKs pitch my editor, you know?
Yeah.
Like, I'm like, "Okay, you're gonna send this to me? Just let's just share it here." Anyway, yeah, it's not an exciting or fun element of being somebody who I think the cliche would be puts themselves out there. But there are also so many fun benefits. Can we go back to Free Boswell for something? Because I want to tell you kind of a cute, very small nugget, which is one of my a super teeny tiny kind of gig that I have right now is advising the playwright Michael Healy on a play that he's writing about the Rogers saga. So again, I bring it up only because there's these, like, you don't know where things will take you necessarily, and it's that kind of thing is not why I built any kind of expertise, but it's just, like, a really fun, kind of shiny it's just, like, such a joy that it makes all the other kind of, staying up late on your laptop, waking up early kind of thing, it makes it worth it in this way where it's like, "This is so fun, I'm helping a creative genius, like, learn about a topic that he wants to write a play about." Yeah, he's way more interesting than me, you should be interviewing him, you should just end the interview now and call Michael Healy,
That sounds like a really cool job, and
right?
I can imagine. I'm excited to watch the play once it
Me too,
comes.
me too. Yeah, yeah,
Uh, you should. The actor who plays Logan Roy should have some kind of
yeah.
role in the
Right?
saga.
I'm with you, I'm totally with you.
Um, to kind of zoom in a little bit
Mhm. We've zoomed out,
kind
let's zoom in, let's do it.
to kind of some of the skills that you think that are required to be a policy entrepreneur.
Mhm,
Yeah, I guess Vass, like if someone is thinking, "Hey, I want to get involved in policy entrepreneurship," and you've talked about, one of the piece of advice is kind of like say yes, like take initiative. But what are other kind of concrete kind of pieces of advice that you would have to like
mm.
a young person in their 20s who maybe is interested in policy entrepreneurship but doesn't know how or where to get started?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, volunteering, finding those kind of micro communities. I used to volunteer with like Better Budgets Toronto or TEDx Toronto, or I was learning through Dames Making Games, which was a collective for women interested in building video games. Like, I'm not a gamer, but I did build a game where you lasso elephants, and it was an abstraction of gerrymandering. You can imagine how cool that game was, but I learned how to like program it and put music and talk about, it's like, this is a way to think about electoral boundaries. It's like, Vass, what are you doing in your spare time? Like, what are you doing? But it was fun, right? And like, ultimately, I was having fun. So, you know, I, I would say to someone to dabble, to read, to go to interesting films and book launches and conversations, depending on what your geography is. If you live in a more urban place where you can take advantage of those things, view those as micro investments in yourself and your thinking. Uh, Learning doesn't end just because you're finally done school, right? And too many people, I think, stop their learning or minimize their learning too much at that time, and don't feel badly if if you start a project and don't totally finish it or something, or you thought you had an interest in a particular subject area and you don't, like, don't beat yourself up about it. We're all kind of searching and figuring out ourselves and who we really want to be, but also admit to yourself who you do want to be when you grow up. Because I think that deep down we all kind of know. It's just really scary to admit it to yourself, right?
I think that that's great advice. And one of the questions that came to mind is like, you're somebody who comes up with so many different ideas, like,
Hmm.
and policy recommendations. And I feel like you're working on such a diverse range of kind of things. And I love always reading your different kind of pieces.
Thanks.
Personally, because every time when I read it, I'm like, oh, this is a new kind of subject. It's cool to see Vass writing about something
Hmm.
um, or things in such diverse fields. I think something that a lot of young people sometimes struggle with is like coming up with these kinds of ideas.
Hmm.
So, what advice do you have for
Hmm.
somebody on how to put themselves in positions where they are coming up with sort of unique policy ideas, or maybe not even unique, but
Hmm.
just coming up with some somewhat novel ideas that they can then
Hmm.
be entrepreneurial about?
You know, I mean, I'm not always entrepreneurial with the ideas. Like sometimes I write something because I think it's important, but I just have the relief of saying it. I don't necessarily shop it around or knock on any politician's doors. If a staffer or someone then comes to me, then yeah, I jump on the phone and I explain things and I share my notes. Um, yeah, for somebody who wants to kind of start to be in the idea space, I'm not sure. It's sort of a hard thing to say. I don't know if it's about practicing, right? Like for 2.5 years, I had a live radio show with Allison Smith. So this was a while ago, but that was kind of free media training for both of us. They co host a show in Canada Land, they're a journalist. And now I host a show with the Globe and Mail where I get to also pitch ideas and also get rejected. Like I get rejected by our executive producer and my editor at the Globe, like all the time, but start to kind of carve things out. So, wait, let me say that my number one tip is to have like a kitchen cabinet, right? Like trusted friends who you share drafts with and share ideas with. And you need to be able to get comfortable getting shredded by these people, but also shredding them, like, create reciprocity. That's, I think, something I don't want to say it's secret, but it's like it's not visible to others that sometimes with a draft or something I've appealed to a couple of friends who have gotten in the Google Doc and gone in comment mode and gone to town and sort of being like, this rules, this sucks, this doesn't make sense, delete this. And then we talk about it. And my thinking is better because of that. And hopefully I'm able to kind of contribute to their thinking and their projects too. Um, but yeah, I don't have like a tweetable like hashtag, but uh, I guess maybe it's just good and honest and transparent for me to say, I don't really know, but here are some of the things I did that in hindsight, I can tell you a beautiful story about how they worked for me, but kind of in the moment, who knows kind of thing.
I think it kind of relates a little bit to what you were talking about earlier too. Like the more that
Mm,
you say yes to things, particularly at the beginning of your career,
yeah,
the more you expose yourself to diverse ideas, diverse people, diverse
exactly.
experiences, that then increase your likelihood to come up with ideas that are a little bit more thought provoking.
And no one's going to push you as hard as you can push yourself. And I don't want to sound like a workaholic kind of demon. I just mean it's you who's gonna say, "Do I feel like going out to that live taping of The Moth tonight?" Which is something that I'm doing, or do I wanna, like, stay home and relax? Probably I wanna stay home and relax, but I'm gonna feel really good when I go, it's gonna be fun, right? Like, no one that's up to you, right? Getting yourself to places, getting yourselves in rooms or doing those activities is up to you. At the same time, I didn't have the kind of noisiness of online when I was in those early days of carving out my career. Online was more of a fun space and less of a competitive space, and we didn't have that many apps. Like apps were kind of novel, and I didn't even really use the camera that much on my phone. It just like Instagram was just starting, in Fair Verona, where we lay our scene. So I'm very cognizant that there are many distractions and many ways we can feel that we're being busy, but we're not actually doing anything. And be careful of that too. Now I sound like a mom, eh? Yeah, I am a mom. So that checks.
I
You're like,
think
oh
for a
my
lot,
God. What did
well,
she just say?
there's a lot of different ways that I could kind of take this,
Sorry.
but one thing is I loved your workaholic demon point. I was like,
Yeah.
I feel I should add that to my personal email signature. Scott Stirrett, workaholic demon.
Yeah. You
But
know what I mean. You know what I
workaholic.
mean.
What I would say is, yeah, I mean, I think to the point of, I mean, one thing's in the context of Venture for Canada, we talk about with the young people, is there's that line always between healthy striving and,
Right.
perfectionism. And I think healthy striving is really important. And I think
Hmm.
sometimes in all the talk around self-care, et cetera, it's also to say that it's, I think, important part of well-being of also being ambitious.
Hmm.
And there's always, that line of kind of balance, and that's certainly something that is a theme across a lot of podcast episodes in
Yeah.
the context of Venture for Canada. And a context too is that sometimes there's periods of months or even a year that are really intense and that kind
Yeah.
of need to be really intense.
Yeah. 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 That's well said. There's crunchy times, but there's down times too. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. One thing that we talked about when we were prepping for this episode was the importance of like owning your voice.
Mm.
One thing that I feel both in this episode, but in all of the kind of interactions we've had, is you do a really good job of like owning your voice. And I
Oh,
think you
thanks.
have like I think you have a very idiosyncratic and unique like
Hmm.
voice. And
Okay.
I think that that's one of the things that is, I think, really compelling about your work, both like the way you speak,
Thanks.
but also I think the way you write. Like, and it
Thanks.
relates to the humor comments, right? Like, I think
Mhm.
you're able to be both very serious and very witty at the same time in a way that like very few people
Thank you.
are able to.
Hmm.
But on this broader question, Vass, of like, what advice? Maybe the first question I have for you is like, do you think owning your voice is something that is really important? And what advice do you have for people to own their voice if you do think it's important?
So I realized that it was important to me in that I was in context sometimes where my voice didn't feel like it was totally mine, right? So when I was working at a larger technology firm, it's still called Airbnb. I spent 2 years there. My social media presence was suddenly affiliated with the company. So what did that mean? And I wanted to make sure that, on social media, which is something I saw as like personal and individualized, that was just me. I'm not representing the company. I'm not the company. I'm not doing press releases. You know what I mean? I'm not saying anything that someone else wrote for me. So I started to feel that kind of chafing. And I realized, okay, I'm actually, or when I was working in politics, right, directly in politics as a staffer, I just kind of realized like I really like the work. The work is fundamentally interesting to me, and the people are interesting, and I'm learning and I'm taking a lot, which sounds very selfish, and it is. Um, but that I didn't want my voice to sort of be an extension of those institutions. And things sort of kind of developed from there. I had to pay attention to like what I was gravitating towards. What I was gravitating towards was like I really loved the live radio show. That was like a really precious hour to me. It was Mondays, 9 to 10 a.m. So like I always got to start the week with it. We did the work kind of on the weekend. Owning your voice, some people are very good at being ambassadors. Foot soldiers is the word I use, which is maybe more charged, but representing their firm as a person, kind of being an extension of their employer. Um, I'm less good at that. Doesn't feel comfortable for me. And I just sort of had to pay attention to that. And I'm lucky to be anchored at a place that values intellectual independence at a university and get to do research and sort of get to speak not for McMaster University, but as somebody who's at McMaster University and to kind of play around that way. So yeah, owning your voice, outside of like AI, copyright, and intellectual property kind of conversations. I guess it depends. It depends the kind of work that you're in and what it is you're trying to achieve. If you ask me what I'm trying to achieve, I actually don't have like a great answer for you. I What do I know I want to do for sure? I want to do interesting things that are meaningful and I want to have fun. And those are my guiding lights. And I have a toddler now. So, that work monster that we heard about earlier, she's a bit different now. And she has different priorities and she has different time constraints. And sometimes she gets hand, foot, mouth disease. So that's offered a kind of recalibration. Um, I do sometimes say no to things. I'm learning that. I know is really hard for me. And I think it's part of that millennial, Anne Helen Peterson has done such great writing on this, but it's kind of, I do have a feeling where I'm kind of like, well, what if I say no? Like, what if I never get asked again? What if this opportunity like never comes back again? And it's just kind of like, there's no way that's going to work. Like, don't make that commitment, or you also won't be able to do a great job. And now and then I've been catching myself because I'm doing a little bit of just in time delivery and I'm not proud of that. It still works out, but, if you're crash landing the plane, maybe don't take that flight sort of thing.
I love that, Anne, Helen Peterson, like that. I remember the essay when it came out on BuzzFeed,
Oh my
which
god,
ended
I
up turning
know,
into a
right?
book.
Yeah. Yeah, because it hit, right? It just hit. She sort of put her finger on something that we were all kind of feeling and trying to make sense of, or maybe not realizing was so different a generation ago. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember reading it. I remember exactly where I was and just thinking, like, I was on my phone and just reading it, like, so enthralled, and
Of
I
course
was
you
like,
read it on your phone. Of course you read it
yeah,
on your phone.
exactly. And I just remember thinking, like, I've never felt like so heard, and especially
Right?
some of the parts about like do yoga, like how self care even in
Is
our
work,
tangent.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, 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 that it's work, that it's work. Well, I appreciate, I think our generation is really frank about parenthood too, and that's a shift, and that's something I've benefited from, before deciding to be a parent, seeing certain pioneers or reading discourse or people online or people who were able to sort of be transparent about juggling all those things, where I think a generation ago was sometimes a bit more private or personal. And again, the presented self was only the kind of polished, formal, professional self. And that's okay, and that's maybe what works best, but that's not everyone, and it's not really realistic.
And to your point, it's like that shift of like when we were like, I think Lean In, the book came out like, when I was graduating university, like probably 2012, 2013. And like
Yeah,
that book had a certain zeitgeist of just
it
like,
did, it did.
just lean in. And then I remember, what's Anne-Marie Slaughter had a
Yeah.
book then about titled Why Women Can't Have It All,
Oh my
which I
god, you're
feel is
very feminist. I also read that one and had it on my shelf. Yeah.
which is, although I feel like that title, anyway, but in some ways, why it's an
Well,
interesting.
In the US, right, it's a lot harder, right? Very
Oh,
short parental leave, no childcare, healthcare things, forget abortion and everything that's happening there. But I didn't mean to interrupt you, but yeah, it still applies to Canada. I don't mean to minimize it.
No, but I agree. I mean, you look at there's huge challenges I think parents can have, and I think the popularity of Slaughter's book, I think indicates that they're um, that lean in kind of advice that we got
Mhm.
when we were starting out wasn't really kind of sustainable.
No, no, no.
Um, One kind of more tactical thing to sort of zoom in a little bit to as well, like as we kind of more wrap things up, is
Sure.
op-ed writing, and one thing that a lot of young people um, have asked me sometimes, and I've heard is this idea: oh, I love to write op-eds, but I don't know how to
Mm.
start. So, what advice do you have for would-be policy entrepreneurs on how to get into the op-ed writing game?
Read a lot and pretend you're the TA reading them. Like, honestly, being, I'm not a capital P professor, I'm a sessional. Let's be real. But I find when my mind is being a bit more critical when I'm reading, it helps me sort of think about my own writing. Just like going to events has helped me think about, like, presenting when I see someone do something really well, right? I'm kind of like taking a mental note or sort of observing that. So it doesn't just have to be like an active learning from you producing something. If you want to be writing, I think offering scrutiny and looking at kind of different outlets and different voices. One of my policy mentors, he's been bugging me for years, and his sort of advice to me has been, for a few years, he's like, I want you to find someone, and that you really admire, and we're just going to kind of build that way. Like, we're just going to, look at how they did their career and kind of take those clues for you. And just to, like, it wasn't working because I was like, well, I just can't find anyone. Like, that's not me. We're just going to kind of have to cobble this together ourselves. But I appreciated that he was sort of putting that forward. I don't know why I brought that up, actually. It's kind of different from op ed writing. Um, but if you want to write, you should write. And opinion editorials are different in that they have to have a news hook. So you're kind of always, you might have something in your back pocket that you kind of want to say, but there's the right moment kind of isn't there. So watching for the moment, I think, is the biggest element of actually getting published. It doesn't mean that what you wrote wasn't great.
The hook, I think, is a really important thing to emphasize in the context of op-ed writing.
Mhm.
That there has to be that degree of topicality, because
Yeah.
ultimately newspapers have to sell papers.
Yeah, or, they're not kind of just ideas magazines, but sometimes there are ideas magazines like Policy Options, or I think places like The Hub are kind of more open to publishing ideas and things that people are talking about outside of a formal newspaper space.
One, to the topic of like the hub, which
Mhm.
we've had Sean Spear on the BFC podcast
Great.
as well,
Hi,
and
Sean.
I think he's a policy entrepreneur
Oh,
as well.
totally, totally.
And I think one of the things I also admire about your work, Vass, is that we live in increasingly like politically polarized times where
Mm,
people kind of get pigeonholed and to say, okay, this is a liberal idea person. This is a conservative idea person. And you're somebody who worked across different political parties,
Yep.
and I feel like is able to provide recommendations that people with diverse political ideologies can kind of like listen to. I
Hmm.
guess, what advice do you have for would-be policy entrepreneurs on how to kind of navigate our perilous politically polarized times and be a policy entrepreneur that isn't pigeonholed onto kind of one side of politics?
Well, I think there are ways to present ideas that don't have to be, back to the hook, like hooked on criticizing a particular partisan stripe. I found when I was doing the work under the Ford government, there was a lot that we were putting forward that the government was appreciating the work that was actually very aligned with like the BC NDP government, like, right, like a surprising kind of areas or openness to kind of thinking about those policy solutions. So sometimes it's about framing of the problem and kind of the opportunity. Sometimes the political aspect of policymaking is, sort of presenting an opportunity maybe to lead or to be the first. Sometimes that's compelling for particular governments, sometimes it isn't. Um, yeah, I mean, there are two things that other people have said to me that have stuck with me that weren't, my boyfriends. One was Roger Martin, when we worked at the Martin Prosperity Institute, sort of said to everyone some version of like that he didn't really care about like what our job title was or how senior we were, that we actually all had the exact same job. And that job was to be two words, relentlessly useful. And I try to bring that to like micro, like the little freelance opportunities I have. I just try to like relentlessly useful. Like, again, if it's worth doing, it's worth overdoing. Just I try to do a great job. So I don't know what kind of takeaway is there for you. Um, but the second is that another policy mentor of mine was kind of like, don't be careful you don't become predictable. And I think there can be a predictability that causes people to kind of zone out if you're always kind of banging on the same drum, or that the drum is very partisan. So I don't know if I become predictable, message me so we can fix that. But give yourself the latitude to not be predictable. Yeah. I don't know.
I think so many people are very predictable in our world, and I think that
Which
that's
can be
great advice.
comforting. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
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 To kind of close things off, you have a new book called
Sure
"The
do.
Big Fix"
Mhm.
that is recent, or you're about to do a book tour.
Yeah.
Um, can,
Canadian
can you
bookstore.
can you describe a little bit about like what is this? What is the Big Fix, and how did the book come to be? Also, with the kind of that framing of for would-be listeners who maybe want to write like a policy book in the
Yeah.
future.
I had two different conversations with two different publishers in Canada before that book opportunity came up about different books that they wanted, and honestly, it was so flattering, but they just weren't the books that I wanted to write. Um, I took a course. I took this little micro course through the pandemic university called Writing Nonfiction Book Proposals. It was Monday nights. It was great. I learned a lot. And this opportunity actually came to myself and a friend and a colleague, my co-author, Denise Hearn, um, through McGill. It's actually a book prize. Each year they appoint essentially a person, and I guess with us it was a two for one deal, where you focus on a major issue of economic relevance to Canada, and they wanted the book to be about competition. So that's how it came up. My son was 3 months old at the time when they sort of first called us about it, and I was like, "Oh, okay, I'm through the fourth trimester. Like, I could, let's do it. It'll be fun." But again, that element of fun is probably what sustained us through that project, because there's on like I sometimes get stuck watching Facebook Reels, and there's a song that goes on there. It's like, "Don't ask me how I did it. I just did it. It was hard." You know that? Have you ever heard it?
I
You should dub it
probably
in. You should dub it
I
in.
should.
I would say that about co-authoring the book. But again, you know, negotiating, pitching each other, double the trouble, double the fun. I don't think co-authoring is half the work. I think it's double, but in like the best ways. So that's how the book came about. So we had about a year, right, to write. Um, we had a 10,000 word writing constraint. So 10,000, sorry, 30,000 words, about 100 pages. And, what an honor, what a privilege. And we get to deliver these three main lectures across Canada. And we have a few other kind of book opportunities before I went on family leave. I was actually calling it my sabbatical, like professionally. Like I think some people didn't really know I was pregnant, and a lot of very, I think, healthy natural anxiety about losing momentum in my career, about disappearing, about not getting invited to things anymore. I kind of primed my core network, like invite me to that lunch, invite me to that dinner, invite me to a cool Zoom. Like maybe I can come. It's my job to say no. Don't say no, no for me. Which actually I think did really help because I think people think they're being polite, right? They're like, oh, don't ask Vass or she can't come. It's like, honestly, maybe I can come. I'll just like bring the baby. Who knows what it's gonna be like. Um, yeah, you asked how it came about, how we did it, co-authoring, that's how it came about, happy accident. And if you would have told me that I would come off maternity leave with a book deal and a new podcast with the Globe and Mail, I'd be like, that's not true. There's no way I'm going to pull that off. But I did. And I'm very appreciative of those opportunities. And I think all I can do is sort of run with them, right? Sort of try to make the most of them. Again, if it's worth doing, it's worth overdoing. And I hope people find it interesting. It's very breezy. There's lots of storytelling, there's lots of stats, and it's kind of a diagnosis of how markets have changed in Canada and what we can do about them.
I look forward to checking it out. And then
Thank
the
you.
worth doing, if it's worth doing, it's worth overdoing. Thank you, Vass's X, for that line.
He's a great guy, yeah.
Anonymous person. I think it is actually. It is a good line. It's something I'll think about as well. So maybe to wrap things up, kind of closing question
Mm.
is there anything else you wanted to share? Advice, thoughts, comments for would-be policy entrepreneurs in Canada?
I mean, no, beyond what can appear. Again, we sort of talked on social media, those negative aspects. Sometimes I get to meet people and they're like, I know you from online. And I just feel like, I'm like, well, now I've disappointed them, right? Because now they're kind of seeing behind the avatar. But often what looks highly individualized is often the product of many people, right? Friends encouraging you, people taking a look, editing things, people in your family, a loved one dropping off dinner or taking your baby to the park so you can write for an hour. There's an invisibility to so much that I worry people don't always see because I don't want people to take away from any of the work that I do that it is that I don't have a lot of help because I have a lot of help. And if I didn't, I'd be screwed. Yeah, we could probably end there. Sorry. I don't know. That is something I sort of wanted to say. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's very gracious and generous kind of words to end on. Vass, it's been a pleasure. Normally, we
Mm.
when we start off, we say, "Oh, the interview will be like 45 minutes or so." We're now around an hour, and I
Oh
think
my
that that's
gosh.
a testament to the fact that this has been a really fun conversation,
Oh, thanks.
and I'd always love speaking with you, and I really appreciate you being a guest on BFC's podcast, A New Wave of Entrepreneurship.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for being so patient with me.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our socials and through our email list. And be sure to subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss our next episode. Have feedback on today's episode? Let us know directly in the app. Thanks again for listening and for joining the new wave of entrepreneurs. Till next time.